Certainly the gung-ho periods have dropped away. I guess I can speak as a journalist myself when I was freelancing for about 10 years, covering in New Caledonia major conflict there. Again, the indigenous Kanak people rising up against French colonial rule. And as a freelancer, there was virtually no real support, and particularly in a conflict situation. And that really applied across the board to mainstream journalists as well. But there have been changes, and Australia's generally rather ahead of New Zealand. But comparing the situation between Australia and New Zealand at that time, clearly there were organisations in Australia that were pressing ahead with some major reforms and how they approached the duty of care for staff members going into conflict situations. And the ABC deserves a lot of credit for that.
As David Roby, the Pacific Media Centre Director, explained, times have changed, but he believes Australia and New Zealand still have a long way to go. The Press Freedom Index is based on analysis of conflicts and freedom of information laws. Journalists Without Borders, the author of the report, says a ranking of some countries has been affected by a tendency to interpret national security needs in an overly broad and abusive manner, much to the detriment of the right to inform and be informed. We discuss these issues with the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma Asia Pacific Managing Director, Kate McMahon.
Things are changing, and I think generally speaking in the wider community it is more okay to talk about this thing, of trauma exposure and trauma effects. It is okay to say, oh yeah, look, I see a therapist. Also too, there's just not the same culture in newsrooms now. I think with the news cycle, people don't have time to go and sit at the pub together and sort of get blotto. It's just, I'm sitting and working in a newsroom as we speak, and it's just, the pressure is just go, go, go.
Do you think we're seeing the end of the gonzo days of journalism where it was actually okay to go off to these war zones or go into a bushfire and just go home and deal with your family there?
Yeah, look, I think it's changing a little. It's still around in some news cultures. Look, I think that is still happening. What is concerning to me is that newsrooms are constricting. So we well know that people are being laid off in newsrooms, and so there's a larger pool of freelancers out there that are going out individually. We've also got a lot of younger journos or people that are still in journalism school that are taking themselves off to a lot of those war zones and those places and getting into trouble. There was a very young journalist that was killed recently in a conflict area, and I mean the question is whether that person was actually a journalist yet or whether they were still studying. I know that was being discussed, and also what constitutes a journalist now. So whilst the gonzo attitude might be diminishing a little, we've still got this situation where people are going off on their own through necessity often, because newsrooms, as I said, are constricting, and then getting into all sorts of trouble, because we know isolation and working in these situations is a real cocktail for post-trauma effects. If you're isolated and being exposed to this stuff and just coming back on your own, it's not good.
Times were tough for journalists in the 70s, and they're still tough now, but for different reasons. Newsrooms across Australia and New Zealand have constricted and in some cases been reduced to skeleton crews. Journalists, stringers and students are at risk as they head into conflict areas without adequate support. Despite the Press Freedom Index rankings for Australia and New Zealand, is it time for both to examine how they support their journalists?